Some children do not grow up doubting that love exists. They grow up doubting whether it will stay. Not because love was completely absent, but because it changed shape. It warmed when they performed well, softened when they were useful, returned when they were agreeable, quiet, grateful, impressive, easy to manage. And so the child began to understand something no child should have to learn so early, that being loved might depend on becoming the right version of themselves. Years later, this lesson rarely announces itself in obvious ways. It lives in habits, in tone of voice, in the apology that arrives too quickly, in the fear of being too much, in the strange exhaustion of always earning a place that should have been freely given. Conditional love does not always remain in memory. Sometimes it becomes personality, the quiet performance. There are adults who seem thoughtful, considerate, unusually self-aware. They notice the mood in a room before anyone speaks. They soften their voice when tension rises. They know how to make themselves useful. They know how to avoid inconvenience. They know how to disappear without leaving. From the outside, these traits are often admired, but beneath them, something quieter may be happening. A life may still be organized around an old fear. If the wrong need appears, if the wrong feeling surfaces, if the wrong truth is spoken, love may recede. This is how conditional love often survives, not as a dramatic wound that can be easily named, but as a quiet performance that never fully ends. It may look like apologizing before there is anything to apologize for, over-explaining small decisions, as if existence itself requires evidence, feeling responsible for the emotional temperature of everyone nearby, becoming deeply uncomfortable when someone is disappointed, hiding pain until it becomes private exhaustion, working too hard to be impressive, calm, needed, exceptional, and feeling strangely restless when love arrives without demand, as if something must surely be owed in return. These are the 7 echoes that often remain, not random behaviors, not personality defects, not proof of weakness. They are adaptations, ancient negotiations, strategies once designed by a child trying to remain close to love. A child cannot walk away from the people who define the world. A child must study them instead, must learn what keeps affection present, must learn which emotions are acceptable, which achievements are rewarded, which imperfections are too dangerous to reveal. So the child becomes attentive, skilled, helpful, self-editing, and eventually this shaping becomes so familiar that it no longer feels like shaping at all. It feels like identity. That is why many adults raised with conditional love do not immediately recognize themselves as wounded. They may simply believe they are sensitive, or high-functioning, or bad at relaxing, or the kind of person who just cares a lot. But beneath the language of maturity, there is often something much older. A child still scanning for signs, still asking, without words, "Am I acceptable right now? Am I safe in your disappointment? Can I still be loved if I stop performing?" For someone shaped by conditional love, these are not abstract questions. They are the hidden architecture of ordinary life. Where love became earned, conditional love rarely arrives wearing its true name. It may appear as praise that only follows achievement, tenderness that only comes after obedience, pride that replaces intimacy, care that feels available, but only to the version of the child that causes the least trouble. Sometimes the home is not openly cruel. Sometimes it is functional, respectable, even loving in visible ways. Meals are served, school is discussed, holidays are observed. The child is clothed, instructed, corrected, prepared. But emotional belonging has conditions attached to it. Perhaps affection grew stronger when the child succeeded, and thinner when they struggled. Perhaps sadness was treated as ingratitude. Perhaps anger was punished more harshly than dishonesty. Perhaps the child learned that a parent's stress mattered more than their own fear. Perhaps love was abundant during compliance and withdrawn during individuality. Perhaps the child was cherished when accomplished, but not truly known. No child has the language to call this conditionality. A child only feels its weather, the sudden chill after a mistake, the silence after disobedience, the praise that feels intoxicating because it is never stable, the subtle message that some feelings are welcome, but others threaten connection. and so love becomes associated with management. To be loved is to regulate oneself for someone else's comfort. To be close is to anticipate. To belong is to edit. This is where many children begin to confuse goodness with disappearance. They become easy, mature for their age, exceptionally empathetic, not because life has made them peaceful, but because emotional survival has made them observant. Sometimes they become the achiever, collecting proof of worth through grades, talent, competence. Sometimes they become the caretaker, soothing the house before the house can wound them. Sometimes they become invisible, asking for little, revealing less, learning that need itself can be risky. Over time, these responses stop feeling chosen. They become the child's version of reality. Love is not something received. Love is something maintained, protected, earned, preserved through effort. And this belief can persist long after childhood ends, because the deepest lessons of early life are rarely stored as thoughts. They are stored as expectation. Expectation that mistakes may cost connection. Expectation that honesty may burden others. Expectation that being fully oneself may be one step too far. The tragedy is not only that a child was loved conditionally, it is that the child often grows up believing this was love's natural form, and then enters adulthood prepared not to question it, but to repeat it. The nervous system remembers. Long after childhood is over, the body may continue living as if love is unstable. This is one of the quieter truths of psychology. Early relationships do not simply create memories. They shape the nervous system's expectations of closeness, safety, and threat. Attachment theory has long described this phenomenon. When care is consistent, a child gradually learns that connection can survive imperfection. That need does not destroy love. That distress can be met without abandonment. This becomes the basis of secure attachment. But when affection is unpredictable, contingent, or emotionally conditional, the lesson changes. The child may learn that closeness must be monitored, that approval is fragile, that emotional expression is dangerous when it inconveniences the bond. In such environments, the nervous system becomes highly adaptive. It sharpens, it scans, it memorizes tone, pacing, facial movement, silence. The brain begins to prioritize relational threat, because relational threat is survival threat for a child. This is why the adult may overreact to seemingly small signs: a delayed message, a subtle shift in mood, a disappointed tone, a moment of distance. These moments do not stay small. They travel backward through the body, touching older meanings. Not safe, too much, something is wrong, fix it quickly. Psychology sometimes calls this hypervigilance. Trauma research speaks of survival states: fawn, freeze, fight, flight. In the child shaped by conditional love, the fawn response is often especially strong. Appeasing, pleasing, over-accommodating, self-abandoning. Not out of politeness alone, but as a strategy to prevent rupture. Even self-worth becomes biologically entangled with approval. If praise was the most reliable pathway to warmth, achievement may begin to feel regulating. If usefulness once protected connection, overfunctioning may feel safer than rest. If emotional suppression reduced conflict, numbness may masquerade as maturity. This is why such patterns are difficult to release. They are not merely beliefs to be corrected, they are states the body learned to trust. To stop over-explaining may feel reckless. To disappoint someone may feel catastrophic. To have needs may feel physically unsafe, even when the current relationship is kind. The body does not always recognize that time has passed. It responds to echoes as if they are present tense. And so the adult may judge themselves harshly for reactions that are, in truth, deeply organized, deeply human, and deeply old. The mind may say, this should not matter so much, but the nervous system remembers when it did, and for many years, that memory was called love. The war inside. Inside many adults shaped by conditional love, there are two loyalties that do not easily reconcile. One loyalty belongs to the present self, the self that longs for rest, reciprocity, honesty, and the quiet dignity of being known without performance. This self wants to speak more plainly, wants to stop shrinking, wants to believe that love can survive inconvenience. The other loyalty belongs to the child who learned that safety lived inside adaptation, the child who survived by anticipating needs before expressing any, the child who still believes that one wrong emotion can change the atmosphere forever, and so an inner war begins. Part of the person grows tired of pleasing, but another part feels panic at the thought of stopping. Part of them wants to set a boundary, but another part hears danger in the word no. Part of them wants to be chosen as they are, but another part does not know who that is without usefulness. This conflict can look like contradiction from the outside. A person may crave intimacy, yet feel exhausted by closeness, may long to be seen, yet hide the truest parts of themselves, may resent being relied on, yet feel worthless when not needed, may recognize unhealthy dynamics, yet remain magnetized by them. Because what is familiar is often mistaken for what is meaningful. When love was conditional early in life, unpredictability may come to feel intimate. Earning affection may feel romantic. Emotional labor may feel like devotion. The self may unconsciously move toward relationships that recreate the original equation, not because pain is desired, but because repetition feels understandable. And every attempt to change this equation can stir resistance. Not laziness, not self-sabotage in some shallow sense, but an ancient alarm. If performance ends, what remains? If people are disappointed, will they leave? If the true self appears, will it still be held? These questions often live below language. They surface as guilt, fatigue, anxiety, numbness, indecision. The person may believe they are simply overwhelmed, when in truth they are standing between two survival maps. One map says, adapt and stay connected. The other whispers, stop disappearing. This is why healing is rarely linear. The old self is not merely stubborn, it is frightened. It was built in conditions where vigilance served a purpose. To understand this is to see the person more gently. There is courage in the one who performs, because performance once protected something precious. There is courage in the one who resists change, because change once looked like danger. And there is sorrow in discovering how long survival can continue after survival is no longer required. The moment of seeing. There is often a moment, not always dramatic, not always loud, when the pattern begins to reveal itself. It may happen in a relationship where love still feels tiring, in a silence that feels disproportionately terrifying, in the familiar ache of trying to be everything and still fearing it is not enough, or in the simple, devastating realization that being loved has always felt more like work than rest. This is the turning point, not because the wound disappears, but because it is finally seen. A person may begin to notice that many of their relationships have been built around the same private bargain. Keep the peace, stay useful, do not need too much, remain admirable, and maybe love will stay. They may notice how quickly they apologize, how often they self-censor, how deeply they fear disappointing others who rarely fear disappointing them, and then something shifts. What once looked like personality begins to look like adaptation. What once felt like devotion begins to look like self-erasure. What once seemed like love begins to resemble repetition. This recognition can be both liberating and heartbreaking, because clarity does not only reveal what happened, it reveals what was missing. The person may grieve not only the conditionality itself, but the years spent mistaking it for normal, the friendships built on overgiving. The romance is organized around proving, the private exhaustion of always shaping the self into someone easier to keep. There is a particular sorrow in realizing that many adult choices were not entirely free. They were influenced by old emotional mathematics. If I am good enough, they stay. If I am undemanding enough, they soften. If I can finally earn it, perhaps this time love will become safe. But love cannot become safe through endless performance, because performance was never the bridge to safety. It was only the bridge away from abandonment, as the child understood it. To see this is painful, and yet there is dignity in this pain. Because the moment of seeing is also the moment the spell begins to weaken. Not all at once, not completely, but enough for the person to pause before the old reflex. Enough to question why kindness feels suspicious. Enough to sense that love requiring constant self-editing may not be love at all, but a reenactment of the first hunger. Awareness does not immediately free the nervous system, but it changes the story, and sometimes the deepest transformations begin there, in the quiet recognition that the life has been organized around earning something that should never have required proof. Learning an unfamiliar kindness. Healing from conditional love is often less like becoming someone new and more like meeting someone who was interrupted. Beneath the pleasing, the vigilance, the competence, the restraint, there is usually a self that never fully learned what it means to exist without auditioning for affection. Not because that self was absent, but because it was rarely safe enough to unfold. So healing begins, not in brilliance, but in unfamiliar kindness. The person starts to notice the harshness of their inner voice, how quickly it measures worth through output, usefulness, emotional control, how instinctively it withdraws tenderness the moment a mistake is made, and slowly they realize that this voice is not random, it is inherited structure, the internal echo of an old atmosphere. For many, this is the first profound shift, the recognition that self-judgment is often conditional love turned inward. The child who once adapted to external standards becomes the adult who polices the self in private. The old conditions remain active even when no one is enforcing them. Love must still be earned, only now the judge lives inside. Healing asks something quietly radical of this system, to allow imperfection without immediate self-punishment, to feel need without automatic shame, to remain present in moments that once triggered disappearance, to discover relationships where disappointment does not become exile, to let care arrive without rushing to repay it with performance. At first, this can feel almost unnatural. Safe love may feel less exciting than conditional love because it does not activate the old chase. Mutuality may feel unfamiliar because there is no role to master. Rest may feel guilty because usefulness once served as protection. And yet, something gentler begins to happen over time. The person notices that they can survive another person's unmet expectation. They notice that honesty does not always lead to rupture. They notice that being loved while tired, uncertain, unproductive, or emotionally real creates a new kind of memory in the body. Not all wounds dissolve. Some grief remains. Grief for the child who learned to translate worth into effort. Grief for the years spent offering polished versions of the self in exchange for closeness. Grief for how long softness felt unsafe. But healing does not ask that the past be erased, only that the old equation is no longer treated as law. And when that begins to happen, even slightly, a person may feel something they have rarely associated with love. Space. Space to be unfinished. Space to be inconvenient at times. Space to remain lovable without performing constant emotional usefulness. For someone raised on conditions, this space can feel almost holy, to be loved without performing. Perhaps one of the saddest things a child can learn is that love must be deserved, and perhaps one of the most beautiful things an adult can begin to discover is that this was never the final truth. The grief remains, of course. It remains in the memory of being praised more than understood, in the years of translating pain into politeness, in the reflex to smile gently while carrying too much, in the private instinct to become smaller whenever closeness feels uncertain. There is no clean ending to this kind of story. The child does not vanish. The old vigilance does not disappear simply because it has been named. Some part of the self may always glance toward the emotional weather, always listen a little too carefully for the shift in tone. But naming the wound changes the relationship to it. What once ruled in silence can now be held in awareness. What once felt like identity can now be recognized as adaptation. What once seemed like proof of inadequacy can now be seen as the cost of surviving love that came with terms. And this matters, because there is a quiet freedom in understanding that the habits formed in conditional love were never evidence that something was wrong with the child. They were evidence that the child was intelligent enough to adapt, perceptive enough to read danger, devoted enough to remain connected under impossible emotional conditions. There is tenderness in that truth. The child was not needy for wanting stable love, not selfish for having feelings, not difficult for wanting to be wanted even when imperfect. The child was simply human, and the adult still is. To be loved without performing is not only a relational experience, it is a reorientation of the soul, a slow return from earning to existing, from proving to inhabiting, from carefully constructed acceptability to a more fragile, more honest form of presence. This does not always look triumphant. Sometimes it looks quiet, a boundary spoken without apology, a need admitted without shame, a silence no longer rushed to fill, a moment of receiving care without immediately turning it into debt. Small moments, almost invisible, and yet, within them an old history begins to loosen, because love, in its healthiest form, does not ask a person to disappear in order to remain. It does not require perfect usefulness. It does not harden at the sight of need. It does not make a child earn what should have been given freely. The deepest healing may simply be this: to stand at last in the presence of love, one's own or another's, and feel no urgent need to become someone else, only the slow, unfamiliar peace of remaining.